The first whistle had not yet sounded when Charlotte Talbot saw him. She stood on the warped wooden platform of the Redemption Creek train depot with nothing but a battered leather trunk, a reticule clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and the suffocating knowledge that every single person she had trusted in this life had lied to her. The Arizona Territory morning was just beginning to breathe, the sky still bruised purple at its edges, and the air smelled of iron rails and red dust, and something else she could not name, something like the particular loneliness that settles over a person when they have finally run out of road. She had arrived on the overnight stage from Tucson with $3.42 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, a one-way ticket to nowhere in her coat pocket, and a letter she had read so many times the creases had gone soft and translucent as old skin. The letter had promised her a husband, a home, and a future. What it had not promised, and what she had only discovered 48 hours ago in a boarding house room in Tucson that smelled of mildew and broken promises, was that the man who had written the letter, one Gerald Hatch, prosperous rancher of Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, 1882, was already married, had been married for 11 years. Had a wife named Eunice and 3 children, and apparently a dark habit of writing to women in the East Coast newspapers under false pretenses. She had come 2,000 miles. She had given up her position as a seamstress in Philadelphia. She had sold every piece of furniture she owned, every last stick of it, to buy the fair West. She had come here with hope folded neatly inside her chest like a letter inside an envelope. And Gerald Hatch had burned it to ash without even the courtesy of meeting her at the stage. So Charlotte Talbot stood alone at the Redemption Creek train depot at 5:15 in the morning on a Thursday in October 1882, and she was trying very hard not to weep, and she was failing. And that was when she saw him. He was already there. Before the first whistle, before the dawn had fully committed itself to arriving, before the station master had unlocked his booth, before a single other soul had found their way to that platform, he was already there. He sat on the far end of the bench with his long legs stretched out before him, his boots crossed at the ankle, a dark hat tipped forward over his face. A rifle leaned against the bench beside him with the casual intimacy of a sleeping companion. He was not asleep, though. She could tell by the quality of his stillness. It was not the slack stillness of sleep. It was the deliberate, coiled stillness of a man who was paying very close attention to everything around him while appearing to pay attention to nothing at all. He did not look up when she arrived. He simply said, in a voice low enough that it would carry only to her and no further, "You've been standing in one spot for going on 10 minutes, ma'am. In this territory, that is long enough to draw attention you probably do not want." Charlotte stiffened. "I beg your pardon." He pushed the hat up with one finger, and she saw his face for the first time. He was somewhere in his early 30s, dark-eyed and angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that made up these canyon walls. There was a scar at the corner of his mouth, thin as a thread. He looked at her with the kind of directness that most men reserved for card games or disputes about water rights. "I said you are drawing attention," he repeated. "A woman alone with a trunk at this hour crying, I am not crying. You were a moment ago. You were watching me. I was watching everything," he said simply. "It is what I do." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, every instinct in her Philadelphia-trained body telling her to find another bench, another end of the platform, another county entirely. But there was no other bench. And somewhere in the deliberate plainness of his statement, "It is what I do," there was something that felt less like a threat and more like a fact, and in her current condition she had a desperate hunger for things that were simply, honestly true. She sat down at the opposite end of the bench, keeping her trunk between them like a small fort, and stared at the tracks. "Where are you headed?" he asked after a silence that lasted long enough for the sky to turn from purple to a pale, tentative gray. "I have not entirely decided," she said. which was the most truthful thing she had said to anyone in 48 hours. He looked at her sideways. Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, but a slight reduction in the hard defensive quality that sat around him like armor. "That is either very brave or very desperate," he said. "And you do not strike me as a woman given to bravado. Then I suppose you have your answer." He turned away from her then, back toward the tracks, and they sat in silence again, and the sky continued its slow transformation, and Charlotte became aware, somewhere in the tight, wounded center of herself, that this was the first moment since she had arrived in the Arizona territory that she had not felt entirely alone. She had no idea, sitting there on that bench with 6 feet of space and a battered leather trunk between them, that Vernon Monroe was about to become the most important person in her life. She had no idea that she was sitting beside a man with his own hidden damage, his own dark past, his own secrets that he had been carrying so long they had become part of his skeleton. She had no idea that the two of them were about to get tangled up in something that would test every ounce of courage and honesty they had between them. She only knew that, when the first whistle finally came screaming through the pale October morning, she did not feel quite as lost as she had before. That was how it began. Let me take you back 3 days, to the moment when Charlotte Talbot first stepped off the eastbound Butterfield stage at the Tucson depot with her heart full and her luggage optimistic. She was 26 years old, auburn-haired, with green eyes that her mother had always called her best feature, and that Charlotte herself had always considered somewhat beside the point. She was practical, quick-minded, trained in needlework and household management, fluent in the kind of quiet dignity that poor women of good families develop as a survival mechanism. She had grown up in Philadelphia in a household that had once been comfortable and had gradually, through a series of misfortunes beginning with her father's death and ending with her mother's illness and the sale of everything not nailed down, become something considerably less than that. The advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer had been clear and specific. Prosperous widower, age 38, of good standing in the Arizona territory, seeks a wife of sound character, industrious nature, and pleasant temperament. Must be willing to relocate. A home and a secure future guaranteed to the right woman. Serious inquiries only. Reply to Box 14, Redemption Creek, Arizona territory. Charlotte had written her letter with great care, presenting herself honestly, her skills, her situation, her hope that the West might offer what the East no longer could. She had received in return a series of letters from one Gerald Hatch that had been thoughtful, warm, and specific in their promises. He described his ranch, the house he was building, the life he envisioned. He described a loneliness she recognized in herself. He sent her the fare, and she had come. She had arrived in Tucson to discover that the connecting stage to Redemption Creek had been delayed by a washed-out road, which meant she had spent an unplanned night at a boarding house on Congress Street. And it was there, in the small dining room over a supper of beans and cornbread, that she had overheard 2 men discussing Redemption Creek, specifically discussing Gerald Hatch, his wife Eunice, and his apparent habit of importing Eastern women under the guise of seeking a bride. The men had laughed about it, which had made Charlotte feel sick, but she had kept her composure until she reached her room, and there she had sat very still for a very long time. She had not slept that night. Instead, she had made her calculations with the cold precision of a woman who has been knocked down before and knows that the only useful thing to do is to get back up. She could not go back east. She had spent almost everything she had on the journey. She could not stay in Tucson without employment. She had no contacts in the territory, no family, no connections of any kind. She had one skill that could earn money anywhere. She could sew. She could sew beautifully, in fact, with a precision and artistry that had made her small reputation in Philadelphia. Every frontier town needed seamstresses. Every boom town had women who needed dresses made and shirts repaired, and curtains hung and wedding gowns constructed. Charlotte had looked at her situation with clear, dry eyes, and decided that she would find a town with enough population to support a seamstress, and she would start there. Redemption Creek, for all its betrayals, had a population of nearly 800 people according to the stage driver's information, and a new railroad spur that had just been laid the previous spring that made it one of the faster-growing settlements in the territory. She had taken the overnight stage from Tucson not to confront Gerald Hatch. That was a conversation she had no interest in having, but because Redemption Creek was large enough to need her, and because she had already purchased the fare. And so she had ended up at the depot in the blue-gray hour before dawn, crying quietly and trying not to. And she had found Vernon Monroe already waiting on that bench like he had been placed there by fate or providence or whatever force it is that occasionally intercedes in the lives of people who have exhausted their own resources. Vernon Monroe was 32 years old and had been a United States Marshal for the last 4 years. Before that, he had been a deputy in 3 different counties across Texas and New Mexico, and before that he had been a great many other things, some of which he was proud of, and some of which he kept locked in a part of himself that he did not open in company. He had come to Redemption Creek 6 weeks ago in pursuit of a man named Cole Draper, who was wanted on charges of armed robbery and murder in 2 territories, and who had made the particular error of trying to hide in a town with an active rail line, which meant he had to pass through the depot eventually. Vernon had been watching the depot every morning for 6 weeks with the focused patience that was the primary tool of his trade. He was good at waiting. He had learned, through years of necessity, how to become almost invisible, how to sit still and breathe slowly and let himself become part of the furniture of a place while everything around him continued to move. He watched everything and gave away nothing, which was a quality that had kept him alive on multiple occasions and had cost him everything else he had ever cared about on a few notable others. He had noticed Charlotte Talbot the moment she came through the depot gate, because he noticed everyone, and because she was carrying herself with the particular upright dignity of a person who is in the middle of falling apart and is refusing to fall. He had watched her stand at the edge of the platform with her trunk and her reticule and her white-knuckled pride, and he had watched the way her shoulders moved and had understood that she was weeping silently, the way women did when they had decided that weeping was a luxury they could not afford but the body would not cooperate. He had spoken to her because he had seen women alone in frontier towns before, and because the hour was dangerous for a woman alone, and because, whatever private war his professionalism usually won over his sympathy, had been temporarily suspended by the quality of her courage in that moment. He had not expected to be interested in her beyond the basic human concern for her immediate safety. He had not expected her to sit down on that bench and answer him with the kind of direct, quiet honesty that he rarely encountered in anyone, male or female, in his line of work. He had not expected, when the first whistle came screaming through the dawn, and he stood to watch the arriving train with the focused attention of a hunter, that she would say nothing, would not ask what he was looking for or why, would simply gather her reticule and wait without fidgeting, with a patience that matched his own, as the train rolled in on a wave of steam and noise and the smell of hot metal. Cole Draper did not get off that train, but 3 other men did, men whose faces Vernon had catalogued and filed, and none of them were his target, and so he stood down and the tension went out of his shoulders in one slow exhale. He turned to say something to Charlotte Talbot and found her looking at him with an expression that was simultaneously careful and entirely transparent, the way clever people look when they have worked something out and are deciding whether to say it. "You are a lawman," she said, "not a question." "Marshal," he confirmed, "and you are waiting for someone. That tends to be the nature of the job." She considered this. "How long have you been waiting?" 6 weeks, he said, and watched something flicker in her expression. Respect, he thought, or possibly the particular recognition of a fellow traveler in the art of long endurance. The morning was properly arrived now, gold and dusty and warming fast, and the depot was beginning to fill with the ordinary human traffic of a busy day. Charlotte looked at the activity around her with the expression of someone making calculations, and then she looked back at him. "I need to find a room," she said. "And I need to find work. Do you know this town?" "Reasonably well," he said. "Is there a respectable boarding house?" "Mrs. Eliza Holt on Copper Street, $3 a week, clean and quiet." Charlotte reached into her reticule and extracted a small piece of paper and a stub of pencil, and wrote this down with the same methodical precision with which she apparently approached everything. Vernon watched this and found himself, to his considerable surprise, reluctant to let her walk away. "The Mercer Brothers Dry Goods," he said, before she could put the pencil away. "George Mercer's wife Clara has been saying she needs help with the seamstress work since spring. Might be worth asking." Charlotte looked up from her paper. Their eyes met properly for the first time in full daylight, and something happened in that meeting that was simple and electric, and neither of them commented on it. "Thank you," she said. "Mr. Monroe, Vernon Monroe, Charlotte Talbot." She extended her hand with the formality of a woman who had been taught that manners were a form of dignity, and he shook it with the equal formality of a man who recognized and honored this. "I am very grateful for the directions, Marshal Monroe." "Vernon," he said, and was surprised that he said it. She looked at him a moment longer. "Vernon," she agreed, and there was something in the way she said his name carefully, like she was learning the shape of it, that he felt in his chest somewhere that was not remotely professional. She picked up one end of her trunk. He picked up the other end without being asked, and she gave him one sharp look that evaluated him thoroughly and then apparently decided to allow it. They carried her trunk through the depot together in the manner of people who have known each other considerably longer than 20 minutes. Outside, in the full morning light of Redemption Creek, Charlotte stopped and looked at the main street with the appraising eye of a woman taking stock of territory. The street was packed dirt and horse traffic. There was a general store, a hotel, a saloon, a barber shop, a small church at the far end, and in between these, the clustered wooden facades of a town in the active process of becoming. There were more people than she had expected, more noise, more energy, the particular electric quality of a place that believes itself to be on the verge of something. She took one deep breath and straightened her spine and squared her shoulders, and in that moment Vernon Monroe understood that whatever had brought her to this territory, and whatever had shattered her plan on arrival, she was not a woman who would spend long in the wreckage. She was already moving toward the next thing. "Copper Street," she said. "Which direction?" He pointed. She nodded. She took hold of her end of the trunk. "I can manage from here," she said. "I know you can," he said. And then, because he was not ordinarily a man given to impulse but the morning had already been an unusual one, he added, "I eat supper at the Widow Peabody's restaurant on Main Street most evenings, in case you find yourself wanting company." Charlotte Talbot looked at him with those green eyes in the October sunlight, and the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was traveling in that direction. "I will keep that in mind," she said, and picked up her trunk and walked away down the street, and Vernon Monroe stood in front of the depot watching her go with the specific unsettled feeling of a man whose well-ordered life has just been quietly and irrevocably disturbed. The boarding house on Copper Street was exactly as described: clean, quiet, and presided over by Mrs. Eliza Holt, a compact woman of 50 with sharp eyes and a dry manner that Charlotte immediately recognized as a form of kindness. The room was small but private, with a window that looked onto a back lot where someone had planted a small kitchen garden and mostly succeeded. There was a bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall where Charlotte hung the one good dress she had brought. She sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 5 minutes, allowing herself that much time to feel the full weight of her situation. The betrayal, the isolation, the particular vertigo of being 26 years old and starting completely over in a place where no one knew her name. She gave those feelings their 5 minutes, and then she stood up, washed her face, changed her collar, pinned her hair with the precise efficiency of a woman who understands that appearance is a form of strategy, and went out to find the Mercer brothers' dry goods. Clara Mercer was a round-faced woman of 30 with ink stains on her fingers and a harried expression that softened considerably when Charlotte showed her 2 samples of needlework she had carried in the bottom of her trunk all the way from Philadelphia, a piece of shirring so fine it was nearly invisible, and a strip of lace she had tatted herself during the long train ride to St. Louis. Clara Mercer looked at these 2 items for a considerable time. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Philadelphia," Charlotte said. "I had a small seamstress practice there for 4 years. What brings you to Redemption Creek?" "The railroad," Charlotte said, which was true enough. Clara Mercer hired her on a trial basis at 50 cents per garment for alterations and $1.50 for constructed pieces, which was fair, and offered her use of the back room with its good north light and the Howe sewing machine that had been gathering dust since the previous seamstress had married a cattle rancher and moved 40 miles north. Charlotte sat down at that sewing machine the same afternoon and did not get up until she had repaired 3 shirts, let out a pair of trousers, and begun the alterations on a dress that Clara had been meaning to fit since July. By the end of her first week in Redemption Creek, she had a room, an income, and a modest but growing reputation as the finest seamstress between Tucson and the mining camps to the north. By the end of her second week, she had 3 regular customers and a waiting list. What she also had, in a way that she was not yet ready to examine directly, was supper twice a week at the Widow Peabody's restaurant in the company of Vernon Monroe. The first time had been an accident. She had gone there on her own, on a Thursday evening, because her landlady's cooking was plain to the point of penance, and because she had earned a proper meal, and she had found him already seated at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, exactly as one finds a piece of furniture that has been there so long it has become part of the room. He had looked up and had not quite smiled, but had indicated the chair across from him with a slight lift of his chin that was an invitation without being a demand, and she had sat down, and they had shared a meal with the ease of people who have already established that they find each other's honesty tolerable. They had talked about the town. She had asked questions, and he had answered them with the forthright accuracy of a man who does not consider information to be a form of power worth hoarding. He had told her about the politics of Redemption Creek, the cattle concerns and the mining operations and the railroad interest, and the particular tensions that came with rapid growth in a place that had not fully decided what it wanted to be. He had told her about the changes that the railroad had brought, the new people, the new money, the new conflicts. She had told him about Philadelphia, about the seamstress work, about the advertisement and what it had led to, with the cool, factual brevity of someone who has already processed an event and filed it under finished. She had not dramatized it or asked for sympathy. She had simply stated what had happened, what she had concluded from it, and what she intended to do about it, and he had listened without interrupting and without the expression of condescending pity that she had feared. "You are not angry at him?" Vernon had asked. "I was," she said, "for several hours, but anger requires a certain amount of energy, and I decided my energy was better directed elsewhere." He had looked at her across the supper table in a way that made her feel simultaneously seen and uncertain, and he had said, "That is either the healthiest thing I have ever heard or the most carefully constructed armor I have ever encountered." Charlotte had set down her fork. "Perhaps both," she had said after a moment, and he had nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. By the second supper, the conversation had moved past the polite territory of information exchange into the more complicated territory of actual acquaintance. She had begun to understand the particular architecture of Vernon Monroe, the way he organized himself, the way he thought, the way he managed the considerable distance he kept between himself and the ordinary social world of the town. She had understood, with the perceptiveness of a woman who had spent years observing people in fittings and negotiations, that this distance was not coldness. It was caution. It was the particular care of a man who has been badly hurt and has concluded that the most efficient preventative measure is not to let anyone close enough to repeat the damage. She understood this because she had built a smaller version of the same thing herself. On a Wednesday evening in the middle of November, with the first real cold of the season beginning to press down on the territory from the north, Vernon came to the widow Peabody's restaurant with a tension in his jaw that he was not quite managing to hide. He sat down and ordered coffee and looked at the wall with the expression of a man conducting an internal argument. "Cole Draper," Charlotte said. He looked at her sharply. "You have news about him," she said. "The man you are waiting for." The sharp look softened into something complicated. "How do you know about Draper?" "You have been watching the depot every morning for 7 weeks," she said. "The station master's wife, who is one of my customers, mentioned that the marshal was watching for a fugitive. She did not know the name. But you have been watching, and today something has changed about how you are carrying yourself, and you ordered coffee instead of your usual supper without noticing you had done it." Vernon Monroe looked at her across the table for a long, still moment. "He has been spotted in Millhaven," he said finally. "Miles east. He is moving this direction." "How long?" 3 days, maybe 4. There was a silence. Charlotte poured herself tea from the pot on the table. Her hands were steady. "Be careful," she said. The simplicity of it seemed to catch him off guard. Not advice, not alarm, not the complicated social performance of a woman who is invested in a man's safety but does not want to admit it, just 2 plain words. "I intend to be," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Vernon." "Yes." "Come back." He held her gaze for what felt like a very long time, and in the silence between those 2 words and whatever answer he was forming, something shifted between them that could not be unshifted. A door that had been kept carefully closed, swinging open just far enough that the light came through. And once light is through a door, you cannot pretend it is not there. "I intend to do that also," he said, and the quality in his voice had changed in a way that had nothing to do with professional reassurance. Cole Draper arrived in Redemption Creek on a Friday afternoon, and Vernon Monroe was ready. He had spent the intervening 3 days in a state of focused preparation that coexisted with the strange new awareness that had taken up residence somewhere behind his sternum. The awareness of Charlotte Talbot going about her ordinary days on the other side of town, cutting and stitching and pinning and fitting, building her small life with the same careful, deliberate courage that he brought to his work. And the 2 of them having become something to each other that neither of them had named yet, but that felt as real and solid as the Arizona ground under his boots. The arrest itself was accomplished without violence, which was what Vernon always preferred when he could manage it. Draper had come off the northbound train with 3 days of beard and the over-relaxed posture of a man who thought he was clear, and Vernon had been at the end of the platform waiting for him with a deputy borrowed from the county sheriff's office. And it had been done cleanly and quickly, the way good professional work usually is when it is done by someone who has taken the trouble to prepare. He had Draper in the county jail by suppertime and his paperwork completed by nightfall and his horse put up by 8 o'clock. And by 8:15, he was standing outside the widow Peabody's restaurant with the night cold coming down around him, and a feeling in his chest that he did not have precise words for, but that was something close to relief. Not just because the 6-week wait was over, but because the particular anxiety he had not consciously acknowledged. The anxiety that he might not be able to keep the promise embedded in those 2 words, "come back," had been resolved in his favor. He went inside. Charlotte was there. She looked up when he came in, and the expression on her face in that one unguarded moment, the quick flood of something she immediately composed back into her usual careful containment, told him everything he needed to know about where they stood, and what the cost of that standing would be if he chose to honor it. He sat down. He ordered supper. She said, "I heard there was an arrest this afternoon." He said, "Yes." She said nothing else, but she did not look away. After the meal, he walked her back to Copper Street. It was the first time he had done this. They walked through the cold night with their breath making small clouds, and the town was settling into its evening noise around them, the distant music from the saloon, the stamp of horses, a door closing, someone laughing in a house as they passed, the ordinary music of a town at night. At the gate of the boarding house, Charlotte stopped and turned to face him. In the darkness with the cold air between them, she was very clear-eyed and very still. "You are done here, then," she said. Not quite a question. "Draper needs to be transported to Santa Fe for trial," he said. "I should have him on the train by Monday." And after that, there was a pause. The honest answer to this question, the answer that his profession and his history and his long habit of caution all insisted was the correct one, was that his next assignment would take him somewhere else, and that was simply the nature of his life, and that was how it was. But somewhere in the 3 days since Wednesday's supper, something had shifted in the architecture of his thinking, and the answers that had always been automatic no longer felt quite so settled. "I am not entirely certain," he said, and watched her eyes react to this before she had a chance to make them still again. "That is either very brave or very desperate," she said softly, returning his words from their first morning, and the corners of his mouth moved. "Perhaps both," he said, and watched the echo of her own answer register in her expression. They stood for another moment in the cold, and the distance between them was charged with everything that had not yet been said, and then Charlotte said with quiet, careful precision, "I will be here, Vernon." He nodded once. "I know," he said. He did not kiss her. He was not a man who moved quickly toward things that mattered to him, and she was not a woman who would have tolerated being rushed. But as he walked back through the night toward the hotel, he was aware that something irrevocable had occurred, and that the particular freedom he had always assigned to the transients of his life, the no-ties freedom of a man who goes where his badge takes him, had become, in the space of 48 days, something that felt considerably less like freedom and considerably more like a habit he was ready to give up. He transported Cole Draper to Santa Fe on Monday and was back in Redemption Creek on Friday. The U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe had offered him a new assignment, a case in Colorado that would have taken him north for the winter. He had requested instead a reassignment to the southern Arizona territory, citing the active criminal situation created by the railroad expansion. This was true enough and was accepted. What he did not add, because it was not the kind of thing you included in official correspondence with the United States Marshal's office, was that the southern Arizona territory was also where Charlotte Talbot was building her life, and that he had discovered in the 5-day absence to Santa Fe that the quality of his attention to everything around him had diminished in a specific and uncharacteristic way, and that this diminishment could be precisely located to the fact that she was not nearby. He had never in his life been distracted by a person before. He found he did not mind it. He arrived back on a Friday evening and went directly to the boarding house on Copper Street without cleaning up from the road, which was unlike him, and rang the bell for Mrs. Holt. Mrs. Holt answered with the sharp-eyed neutrality of a woman who has run a respectable establishment for 20 years and has seen everything and is surprised by nothing. "Miss Talbot is in the back parlor," she said, before he had said anything other than good evening. "I will tell her you are here," which told him something about what Mrs. Holt thought of the situation that he found, to his own surprise, not uncomfortable at all. Charlotte came to the parlor door with a piece of half-finished lacework in her hand and looked at him for a moment. She looked tired from a long week of work, and there was a small ink stain on her right thumb from the order book she kept, and her hair was not as neat as she usually kept it at this hour, and she was the most welcome sight he had seen in 5 days. "You are back," she said. "I am back," he said. She looked at him steadily. "For how long?" "I have requested a long-term assignment to this territory," he said, "for the foreseeable future, if they approve it, which I expect they will." Charlotte looked at him for a long time without speaking, in the particular way she had when she was reading something underneath the surface of plain words, and then she said with great carefulness, "Why?" And Vernon Monroe, who had spent his adult life being economical with his words and cautious with his admissions and very, very careful about the distances he kept, said, "Because I am not willing to leave." The silence that followed this was very full. Then Charlotte set down the lacework on the parlor table very deliberately and said, "Come inside, Vernon, and I will have Mrs. Holt bring tea." It was the first time he had been inside the boarding-house parlor. They sat across from each other in the stiff parlor chairs, and Mrs. Holt brought tea with the brisk efficiency of a woman who approves of a development and intends to facilitate it with maximum practicality and minimum sentiment, and then left them alone with the conspicuous respect for privacy that indicated she was almost certainly listening from the hallway. They talked for 3 hours. This conversation was different from all their previous conversations, which had been built on the careful structure of two people learning each other's dimensions while keeping their own centers protected. This one went deeper, and it did so because Vernon Monroe made the first move, which was not in the end a declaration, but something more fundamental than a declaration. He told her something true. He told her about his marriage. He had been married at 24 in Texas to a woman named Sarah who was gentle and good and who had loved him with a steadiness that he had not, at 24, fully understood was rare. He had been away too often, the nature of his work, the nature of his ambition, the nature of a young man who has not yet learned to recognize what he has until he no longer has it. Sarah had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1876 when he was away on a case in New Mexico, and he had come home to a grave and a neighbor's letter, and something in him had gone very still and very quiet and had remained that way for 6 years. He told this story plainly, without the dramatics of self-pity and without the false modesty of self-blame, and Charlotte listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You have been carrying that for 6 years," she said. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." She turned her teacup in her hands, thinking. Then she said, "I have not loved anyone, not like that. I thought perhaps it was not something I was inclined toward, or perhaps simply that I had not met the right situation. But I think now," she paused, "I think the truth is that I have been afraid of exactly what happened to you, of giving something real to someone and having it disappear." He looked at her across the small parlor table. "That is a reasonable thing to be afraid of," he said. "It is not a good reason to refuse to live," she said, and he could tell that this was something she had worked out recently, perhaps tonight, perhaps in the last few days, and was saying it aloud for the first time. "No," he agreed, "it is not." That was the night things changed between them. Not dramatically. There were no declarations, no embraces, nothing that Mrs. Holt, had she been watching from the door, would have found romantic in the conventional sense. But something had opened between them that had been closed before, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them moved to close it again. He began spending more time in her company. Not constantly. Both of them had work that consumed most of their days, and both of them valued the particular dignity of not being in anyone's pocket. But regularly, in the quiet, cumulative way that real intimacy builds. He began to know the small things, the way she took her coffee, the titles of the books she borrowed from the town's small lending library, the particular set of her shoulders when she was frustrated, the sound of her laugh when something genuinely amused her, which was different from her polite social laugh in a way that he found himself working to produce. She began to know the small things about him, too. The habit he had of reading newspapers in chronological order, the slight tension he carried in his right shoulder that was an old injury from an encounter in New Mexico, he preferred not to discuss at length, the way he paid attention to rooms and doorways in a manner that was so habitual he probably no longer noticed it himself, the particular quality of stillness he got when he was thinking hard about something that was different from his watching everything stillness. She noticed one afternoon in December when she had let him sit in the back room of the dry goods store while she worked because he had said he needed to think through a matter of town law, and she had said she did not mind, that he had stopped pretending to read his paper and was just watching her work. Not in a distracting way, in the way that people look at things that give them a sense of rightness. She glanced up. He did not look away. "You are staring," she said. "I am," he confirmed. She kept her eyes on her work to hide whatever was happening in her expression. "Is it helping you think through your matter of town law?" "Not in the slightest," he said, and the quality of warmth in his voice unhurried, unguarded. A warmth he clearly was not monitoring made her set down her shears and look at him properly. "Vernon," she said. "Charlotte," he said. They were 3 feet apart, with a cutting table between them and bolts of calico stacked on either side, and the winter light coming through the north window was making everything in the room very clear and very exact. He stood up from his chair. He came around the end of the cutting table. He stood in front of her and said, in the direct, unhurried way he said everything that he meant, "I think I am in love with you. I am fairly certain of it. I wanted you to know." Charlotte Talbot looked at him for a long moment that had no performance in it whatsoever, just a woman and a man and the honest weight of a true thing said plainly. "I think I am in love with you too," she said. "I am more than fairly certain." He kissed her then, quietly, carefully, with the specific reverence of a man who is very aware of what something means. And she kissed him back with equal care. And outside the north window the December light in Redemption Creek was very clear and very cold and entirely indifferent to the fact that 2 people who had both been separately lost had found each other. But that was the nature of December light, and of the Arizona territory, which went about its business regardless. December in Redemption Creek was cold and dry and busy, with the particular commerce of a town preparing for winter, and Charlotte Talbot's sewing room was full from morning to evening, with the pre-Christmas rush of customers who needed gowns made and shirts repaired, and children's clothes let out, and the 100 other needle and thread demands of a community. She was good at managing the work, good at managing the customers, good at the ordered discipline of a full appointment book. What she was less practiced at managing was the question of Gerald Hatch, which she had thought was finished, but which came to a head on a Tuesday in mid-December when Eunice Hatch, a thin woman of 34 with the expression of someone who has swallowed something bitter and chosen to wear the face of it, came into the sewing room and stood in the middle of the floor and said, without preamble, "You are the one he wrote to." Charlotte set down her work. She met the woman's eyes directly. "Yes," she said. "I am sorry, Mrs. Hatch, I had no knowledge that he was married." Eunice Hatch stood very still for a moment. She was obviously deciding something. Then she said, "I know that. I read his correspondence. There were 3 women over the last 2 years. You were the only one who actually came." Charlotte waited. "He will not do it again," Eunice Hatch said. "I have made that clear to him in terms I believe he fully understands. But I came here to apologize. On behalf of the situation, since I cannot apologize for him, as he does not apparently feel that apology is warranted." Her voice was very controlled. The kind of control that is built on top of something that has been burning for a long time. "You do not owe me an apology," Charlotte said carefully. "You are a victim of this arrangement as much as I am. More, I would say." Something moved through Eunice Hatch's expression, not quite grief, not quite relief, but something complicated and real. "You are doing well," she said. It was half observation, half question. "I am," Charlotte said. "I am glad of it," Eunice said and left. Charlotte sat for a while after that with her work in her hands and her thoughts somewhere else. She thought about the dark trap of it, the web of lies that Gerald Hatch had spun, the damage that radiated outward from his choices in every direction, touching not just her but the woman who was actually his wife. She thought about what it meant to be bound to a person whose character was a kind of ongoing betrayal. She thought about what it meant to have found, instead of that, someone whose fundamental quality was exactly the opposite, a man whose plainness and honesty were so habitual they had become indistinguishable from his nature. She told Vernon about the visit that evening. He listened without expression until she finished, and then he said, "If Hatch approaches you, he will not," she said. "I am not his interest and never was. I was only a project." Vernon's jaw tightened. "If he does, Vernon." She touched his arm, which she had not done before in quite that way, the light, deliberate touch of a woman who is staking a small, clear claim. "I am not afraid of Gerald Hatch. And I have resources of my own." He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face and said, very quietly, "I know you do." And then, after a moment, "But I am here." "I know that too," she said, and the certainty in her voice was not the false certainty of performance but the real certainty of a woman who has verified something with her own instruments and trusts the result. January brought a cold snap that lasted 2 weeks and covered the depot platform in a thin skin of frost each morning. And Charlotte, watching the weather through her north window as she worked, found herself thinking about that October morning with a quality of something that was not quite nostalgia, because it was not yet distant enough for nostalgia, but was in the same family of feeling, the retrospective tenderness for a moment that turned out to be a beginning. She mentioned this to Vernon one evening, in the particular ease of their now established supper conversation, and he said, "I knew something had happened when you sat down on that bench." "What do you mean, knew something had happened?" "I mean I was aware that something had changed," he said, with the precision of a man choosing his words carefully. "The morning had altered in some way I could not account for professionally." Charlotte regarded him. "You did not show it. I was working." "You are always working." "Yes," he said, "but that morning it was more of an effort than usual." She smiled at her tea. He watched her smile and thought, as he had been thinking with increasing frequency and clarity, about what he wanted to ask her, and when he wanted to ask it, and whether the when was now. He had sent a letter to his sister in Dallas in late December, telling her that there was a woman in Redemption Creek who was exceptional, and describing Charlotte with the careful thoroughness of a man who is making a case. His sister had replied by return post that it was about time, which was loving and unhelpful in the way that sisters are, and had enclosed a small packet of pressed flowers from their mother's garden in Texas, with a note that said simply, "Give these to her." He had not given them to her yet. They were in the inside pocket of his coat, somewhat worse for travel, waiting for the right moment. February 1883. The winter had softened slightly, the morning frosts retreating a little each day, the afternoons beginning to carry a tentative warmth that was the territory's first, cautious promise of spring. The town had the energy of a place that has survived winter and is preparing itself for growth, new construction beginning, new businesses opening, new people arriving on the railroad that now came twice a week. Charlotte had moved to a larger room at the boarding house, with enough space for her own small work table, and had begun talking with George Mercer about the possibility of her own establishment, a proper seamstress shop, with her name on the door. Mercer was favorable to the idea. There was a vacant storefront on Main Street that had potential. She had spent evenings with her account book and her calculations, and the numbers, while not extravagant, were workable. She told Vernon about the plan on a Sunday afternoon when they were walking out along the creek road south of town, which had become their particular habit when the weather permitted not a long walk, just a half-hour or so of the open air and each other's company and conversation without the ambient noise of restaurants and boarding-house parlors. "You would be your own proprietor," he said. "That is the intention," she said. "My own establishment, my own clients, my own accounts." He was quiet for a moment, thinking, "You have enough capital." "Nearly. I need another 2 months. Clara Mercer will not object to losing her seamstress. I have discussed it with her. She will keep the walk-in alteration work which she can manage. The custom work, the construction is mine." She paused. "I have been careful to build the client relationships appropriately." He looked at her sideways. "You have been planning this since October." "I have been working toward it since October," she said. "There is a distinction. I did not plan it, I made it possible incrementally. There was no certainty, only direction." Vernon stopped walking. Charlotte walked on 2 more paces before she noticed, and turned to find him standing in the middle of the creek road looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately classify because she had not seen it on his face before, something that was entirely unguarded, entirely undefended, entirely there. "I have been thinking," he said, "about asking you something." Charlotte did not move. The creek road was empty in both directions. The afternoon was still and golden and smelled of the particular dry sweetness of late winter scrub. "All right," she said. He came toward her and stopped when there was very little distance between them. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a small packet of paper, slightly crumpled, that he opened carefully to reveal a scatter of flat and dried flowers, blue and yellow, things that had bloomed in a Texas garden and had traveled a long way in service of this moment. Charlotte looked at the flowers and then at his face. "My sister sent these," he said. "From our mother's garden. She said to give them to you." "Your sister, who I have not met," Charlotte said, keeping her voice very even. "Yes, I wrote to her about you." "What did you write?" "That you were exceptional," he said, with the plain directness that was simply how he was made. "And that I was very glad of the morning I found you at the depot." Charlotte took the flowers from his hand. She held them carefully, the way she held things she wanted to keep. "Vernon," she said, "I am going to ask you to marry me," he said. "I am telling you in advance so you are not surprised, because I know you prefer to have information before you make decisions, and I want you to make this one clearly." A brief pause. "Charlotte Talbot, will you marry me?" The creek road was very quiet. Somewhere upstream a bird was making a small, insistent noise. The afternoon light was laying itself in long, warm lines across the red ground. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the middle of the creek road in the February afternoon sun, and it was not a dramatic thing, no fire, no lightning, no sweeping gesture. It was the particular piece of two people who have found the place where they fit, and who are both intelligent enough to recognize it. He held her for a long moment. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and she thought, with the clear-eyed certainty that was her particular form of knowledge, that this was something she had not known she was looking for, and had not known she had found until right now, in this moment, standing in the Arizona dirt with dried Texas wildflowers in her hand. They were married in April. The Reverend Josiah Webb officiated at the small church at the end of Main Street on a Saturday afternoon in early spring, with Mrs. Eliza Holt and Clara Mercer and the Mercer brothers and the station master, whose name was Daniel Prewitt, and his wife Alice in attendance. Charlotte wore a dress she had made herself, from pale ivory wool with a cream cotton voile collar that she had tatted herself during the evenings of February and March, and it was the finest thing she had ever made, not in the decorative sense, but in the sense of its construction, its precision, the way every seam lay exactly true. Vernon wore his good suit, dark blue wool, and had his boots polished to a brightness that the Arizona Territory's dust was already trying to undo. He stood at the front of the church watching her come down the aisle on her own, because there was no one to give her away, and she had decided she did not need giving. And the look on his face when he saw her, the uncomposed, involuntary quality of it, the way he forgot, just for one moment, to be contained, was something she kept in the warmest part of herself for a very long time. Reverend Webb performed a thorough and traditional ceremony, and Vernon said his vows in the straightforward, unhurried manner he applied to things that were real and permanent, and Charlotte said hers in the clear, precise voice of a woman who understands that words are architecture, that they hold the shape of things. The reception was held in the Widow Peabody's restaurant, which was closed for the afternoon for the occasion, and there was roast chicken and apple cake, and something the Widow Peabody called her special cordial that was considerably more assertive than its name suggested, and there was dancing of a modest kind, and there was conversation and laughter, and it was exactly the right size, not grand, not staged, but real. Vernon's sister Margaret, who had received a second letter in February describing the plan, and had responded by booking herself immediately onto the Southern Railroad, arrived 2 days before the wedding from Dallas, and she and Charlotte had taken to each other with the speed and certainty of two people who recognize in each other the same fundamental quality. Margaret Monroe was 30 years old, dark-eyed like her brother, with a quick laugh and an equally quick mind, and the particular fondness for Vernon that is the birthright of sisters who have watched their brothers be stubborn and difficult and ultimately good. She pulled Charlotte aside at the wedding reception and said, in the brisk tone of a woman making a statement of fact, "I could not be happier about this. I want you to know that." Charlotte looked at her. "Thank you, Margaret." "He needed someone like you," Margaret said. "Someone who does not require managing and does not require convincing and does not require being handled gently because they might break. Someone who is simply solid." She considered the word. "That sounds like a terrible compliment, but I intend it as the finest one I know." "It is the finest one I know too," Charlotte said, and meant it entirely. They had taken a house on the north end of town, a wood-frame house with 4 rooms, a front porch, a back lot that had possibilities, and 2 windows that looked toward the creek. It was not large. It was entirely sufficient. Charlotte had spent the 2 weeks before the wedding making curtains for every window, and Vernon had spent the same 2 weeks repairing the back fence and replacing 2 window sills that had let the wind in. And together, they had turned it from a house into something you could reasonably call a home, in the way that 2 people putting their specific competencies to work on a shared project sometimes can. The first night they spent in their own house, after the wedding, after the reception, after Margaret had been seen to the hotel with warm affection, and Vernon's borrowed deputy had been sent home with thanks. The first night of their actual life together, Charlotte stood at the kitchen window looking at the moon over the creek while Vernon locked the door for the night, and felt the very particular sensation of arriving somewhere that she had been traveling toward without knowing it. He came to stand behind her, and she leaned back against him, and they stood at the kitchen window together in the moonlit quiet of their house. "Do you know," she said, "what I thought that first morning at the depot? What did you think? I thought the territory had sent me the most unsettling stranger I had ever encountered, and I was furious at myself for finding it a comfort." He put his arms around her. "And now," she turned to face him, "and now," she said, "I think the territory sent me exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. I think that first morning was the beginning of everything." He kissed her, this time without the careful restraint of courtship, with the full warmth of a man who has decided that he does not need to keep things at arm's length anymore. And she kissed him back with the whole of her, which she had been conserving, she now realized, her whole adult life for exactly this. Spring opened into summer in the Arizona territory with its usual dramatic intensity, the heat building and building until the afternoon thunderstorm swept down from the mountains and broke it for a few brilliant hours, and then let the heat come back, and the desert everything was in flower, and Redemption Creek was growing faster than its streets could accommodate, and Charlotte's seamstress shop opened on the 1st of May. The sign over the door read C. Monroe, seamstress, in gold letters on dark green paint, and she had painted it herself over 3 evenings with a careful brush. And on the morning of the opening she had stood across the street and looked at it with a feeling that she could only describe as the feeling of a thing become real. Vernon had stood beside her with his coffee and looked at it and said, "It is very well done," and then had gone off to his work with the ease of a man who understands that his wife's competencies are not in competition with his own, but are entirely their own wonderful separate thing. The shop thrived. By June she had 3 months of backlogged orders. By July she had hired a young woman named Rosa Martinez, the daughter of a Mexican family who had settled in the territory in the previous generation, and whose needlework was genuinely fine, and the 2 of them managed the volume between them with the organized efficiency of people who like and respect each other's work. The summer also brought a challenge to Vernon's assignment that tested both his professionalism and the new domestic peace he had built. The railroad expansion had attracted several criminal enterprises that were using the new routes to move stolen cattle, and the investigation that the marshal's office assigned him was complex and required him to be away from Redemption Creek for periods of several days at a time, riding to other depots and other towns, and gathering the kind of information that could only be gathered in person. Charlotte adapted to these absences with the practical composure that was her characteristic response to difficulty. She did not like the absences. She said so, plainly, the first time he came home after a 4-day ride, before kissing him and telling him to go wash the trail dust off. There was no performance in her dislike, no dramatics, no accusations. She simply named it as a real thing and then proceeded to manage it, which was what she did with all real things. They had agreed before the first long absence that she would write to him at whatever town he specified, and that he would write to her whenever he had access to a post office, which in the interior of the territory was not always reliable. The letters they exchanged during these periods were the particular letters of two people who have decided that honesty is the governing principle of their life together, and who apply it even to paper, which meant that Charlotte's letters contained not just news of the shop and the town but the actual texture of her days, her thoughts, her occasional struggles. And Vernon's letters contained not just professional summaries, but the things he noticed and thought, and the very specific quality of his attention to their life from a distance. She kept his letters in a green ribbon-tied bundle in the top drawer of the bedroom dresser. He kept hers in his coat pocket, which he considered a private matter, and she considered both touching and entirely predictable. By the time the territorial summer was beginning to exhaust itself toward autumn, Charlotte knew that she was expecting a child. She told Vernon on a September evening when he had been home from his latest circuit for 3 days and they were sitting on the front porch in the cooling evening air, watching the last of the summer light leave the sky in its extravagant gold to red to purple way. She simply said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. She told him. She watched his face very carefully, the way she watched everything that was important. What happened to his face in the moment she told him was something she thought about for years afterward. The way the controlled, calibrated quality of his expression simply fell away, as completely and naturally as a mask in a room where no mask is necessary. And what was underneath it was something entirely clear and entirely open and entirely, overwhelmingly glad. He was not a man given to grand displays. He did not shout or sweep her up. He reached over and took both of her hands in both of his hands and held them and looked at her and said nothing for a long moment because he apparently did not trust his voice. "Vernon," she said gently. "I am here," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "I know you are." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his chest, against the place where his heart was making itself known, and she could feel it, the strong, steady, entirely moved beat of a man who has been given something he had not let himself hope for. "Are you well?" he said finally. Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am very well, in fact." He took a breath. "Good," he said. "Good." He requested a desk assignment for the duration of her pregnancy, which the marshal's office granted without notable objection, and which meant he was in Redemption Creek every day for the autumn and winter of 1883. He used the time to make the back bedroom into a proper nursery, with the same systematic competence he applied to everything, and Charlotte found this, the sight of him measuring and cutting and sanding, the care he took with small details, one of the most reliably tender things she had ever witnessed. Margaret came from Dallas in November and stayed through January, which was both help and entertainment. She and Charlotte developed the kind of friendship that begins in respect and deepens quickly into genuine affection, and the household during those months had a warmth and a noise and a fullness to it that felt, Charlotte thought, exactly like what a home was supposed to feel like. The baby was born in February of 1884, on a Saturday afternoon, healthy and loud and male, with Vernon's dark eyes and Charlotte's auburn hair, and a disposition that announced itself immediately as energetic. They named him James, after Vernon's father, and Thomas, after Charlotte's brother who had died of fever in Philadelphia when they were both children. James Thomas Monroe came into the world in the upstairs bedroom of the house on the north end of Redemption Creek, with the midwife, Mrs. Conchita Vargas, in attendance, and Margaret holding Charlotte's hand with fierce concentration, and Vernon downstairs pacing the kitchen in the particular manner of a man who is extremely good at managing external danger and entirely helpless in the face of the specific vulnerability of waiting. When Mrs. Vargas came to the top of the stairs and said, "Marshal Monroe, you may come up now." He took the stairs at a speed inconsistent with his usual deliberateness, and came into the bedroom where Charlotte was sitting up against the pillows with their son in her arms, and the expression on his face when he saw them, exhausted and radiant and terrifyingly real, was the one Charlotte would remember whenever she needed to remind herself of what mattered. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she placed the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful attentiveness of a man learning something new and treating the learning with the full respect it deserved. And James Thomas Monroe, a very new person with very decisive opinions about the world, ceased his vociferous commentary and blinked his dark eyes at his father with an expression of provisional interest. "Hello," Vernon said to him, very quietly. "I am very glad you are here." Charlotte leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his free arm around her. "Thank you," he said, with the full weight of everything he meant, and she understood all of it. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because life in the Arizona Territory was not without difficulty, and the nature of Vernon's work meant that there were still nights of worry and weeks of absence, and the ongoing undertow of a frontier region that was in the active process of becoming something it had not yet quite become. There were disputes about land and water rights that sometimes turned ugly. There were the injustices that the rapid expansion of the railroad and the settlement of the territory inflicted on the Apache and the other peoples whose land this had been, and was being taken by degrees that the law he served did not always see fit to question. And this sat uneasy in Vernon more than once, and he and Charlotte talked about it with the honesty they applied to everything. The thing they could not fix, the thing that was happening regardless. The moral weight of occupying a landscape that had been occupied before them by people who had been given nothing like the welcome he had found here. There were hard seasons in the shop and seasons that were generous. There was a drought that lasted 18 months in 1886 and 1887 that left the territory pinched and tired and short-tempered in ways that crept into everything, including the quiet life of their household. And Charlotte and Vernon navigated that period with the tested, proven tools of two people who know each other well enough to be honest about when they are struggling. There were also years of abundance and growth and deepening. The shop grew to the point that Charlotte had 2 full-time employees in addition to Rosa, who had become not just an employee but a real friend, and they had to expand the space twice. Vernon earned the respect of the territory in the particular way that quiet, competent men earn respect, not through gesture or reputation, but through the accumulated weight of doing the work correctly over a long period of time. James turned 3 and then 4 and then 5, and revealed himself to be a person of large energy and large curiosity, who approached everything in his world with the same investigative intensity that his father brought to the job and the same efficient, purposeful engagement that his mother brought to hers, and who was a source of nearly constant delight to both of them in ways that still managed to surprise them. In the spring of 1887, when James was 3 and the drought was beginning its second year, and the territory was the color of old bone in every direction, Charlotte told Vernon that there was going to be a second child. Vernon's response was, in its broad structure, the same as the first time, the falling away of the habitual composure, the taking of her hands, the evident and entirely genuine gladness. He had learned in the intervening years to let himself be glad more readily, and this cost him nothing and gave her everything. And she told him so on a regular basis in a way that still sometimes made him look at her with the specific expression of a man who has been given something he does not entirely feel he has earned, but who is not foolish enough to refuse it. The second child, born in January of 1888, was also a son, which they had not predicted but which suited them completely. They named him Samuel, after no one in particular, but because it was a name that felt solid and honest and true, which were their primary criteria for names as for everything else. Samuel Monroe was a quieter presence than his brother from the very first days, with Charlotte's green eyes and his father's habit of careful attention, and the dynamic between the two boys, James loud and kinetic and leading, Samuel watchful and precise, and occasionally devastating in the accuracy of his observations, was one of the great ongoing pleasures of the household. Margaret came every Christmas and stayed through January, which had become tradition, and on her visit in the winter of 1888, she brought news that she was planning to marry herself. A man named William Cole, a lawyer in Dallas, which Charlotte approved of wholeheartedly, and which Vernon received with the fond, slightly interrogative manner of an older brother who loves his sister and takes his responsibilities seriously, until Charlotte put her hand on his arm and said, quietly, "She has good judgment, Vernon," and he had accepted this as the accurate and sufficient statement it was. By 1890, Redemption Creek had grown considerably. The railroad had brought steady growth. The population was approaching 3,000. A proper school had been established, and the wild-at-the-edges quality of the early settlement had smoothed into something more structured without entirely losing the particular energy of the territory. Charlotte's shop was the finest dressmaker establishment between Tucson and Phoenix, which was a fact she mentioned to no one because it was evident from the client list. Vernon had been offered a supervisory role within the marshal's office that would have moved them to Santa Fe, and they had discussed it with their usual thoroughness, the advantages, the costs, what it would mean for the shop, for the boys, for the specific life they had built here, and had ultimately decided to remain in Redemption Creek, because the life they had built was not incidentally located there. It was made of that place. It had grown into it. And neither of them was interested in uprooting it for advancement that did not require uprooting. He had written back to the office with his decision and had received a response that was respectful and accepting, and that was the end of it. He continued his work in the territory. She continued hers. The boys grew. James, at 6, had decided he was going to be a lawman like his father, a decision he prosecuted with great seriousness and considerable imagination. Samuel, at 2, had decided to be interested in everything with equal intensity, which was a position Charlotte found both exhausting and deeply encouraging. There was an evening in the autumn of 1890, a Friday evening, the tail end of an ordinary week, the kind of evening that is unremarkable in the best possible sense, when they were sitting on the front porch of the house on the north end of Redemption Creek, and the boys were inside with their supper, and the sky was doing its nightly performance of extraordinary color, and Charlotte was mending a shirt from the pile that was always there. Because a household with 2 growing boys and 1 working man generated a great deal of shirt mending, and Vernon was reading the territorial newspaper with his feet up on the porch rail. He lowered the paper and looked at her. "You remember the morning I found you at the depot," he said. She looked up from her mending. "I find it more accurate to say we found each other," she said. "You were there when I arrived." "I was there before the first whistle," he said. "You were," she said. "I have often thought about what you were really waiting for that morning." "Cole Draper," he said. "Obviously," she said. "But also, I think, something else. I think you had been waiting a long time for something to change." He considered this for a moment. His face had the quality it had on occasions when she had said something true, and he was taking the time to fully receive it. "Yes," he said finally. "I think that is probably accurate. She looked at him across the porch in the evening light, at the face she knew better than any other face, at the man who had become the fixed point of her days and the warmth at the center of her life. "And did it," she said, "change?" He looked at her for a long, still moment. The sky behind them was burning orange and red, and the distant mountains were going purple, and the air smelled of sage, and the cooling desert, and somewhere inside the house James was arguing cheerfully with Samuel about something of great importance. "Charlotte," he said, with the directness and simplicity that had always been his primary quality and that she had loved from the first morning, "it changed completely." She smiled at him, not the polite, careful smile she used in business, not the measured smile of social navigation, but the full, unguarded smile that she reserved for things that were genuinely true and genuinely good. "Yes," she said, "it did." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, and he turned it palm up and held hers, and they sat like that in the evening light with the mountains going dark in the distance, and their children's voices coming from inside the house, and the territory settling into its nightly quiet all around them. 8 years earlier, Charlotte Talbot had stood alone at the Redemption Creek depot with $3 sewn into her hem and a broken plan, and the specific vertigo of a person who has run out of road. She had stood on that warped wooden platform in the blue dark October morning, and she had been very alone and very afraid, and she had held herself together with the particular composed determination that was everything she had. And he had been there, before the first whistle, already waiting, in the way that he was constitutionally incapable of not waiting with full attention, full stillness, full watchfulness. Not waiting for her specifically fate is not that literal, and she was a practical woman who did not require her stories to be tidy. But waiting nonetheless in the same place, at the same moment, with the same quality of readiness that means when something real arrives, you see it. He had seen her. She had sat down on that bench and they had carried her trunk together through the depot, and he had told her about Mrs. Holt on Copper Street and Clara Mercer at the dry goods store, and neither of them had known in those first early minutes what they were beginning. They knew it now. The boys grew. The shop grew. The territory grew into something new, year by year, with the complicated mixture of progress and loss and injustice and beauty that is the nature of growth in the world. Vernon did his work with the steady, principled competence that had always defined him, and he came home every evening he could to the house on the north end of town, and the life that waited there. Charlotte built her establishment and her reputation and her friendships and her particular, precise form of life with the same methodical intentionality she had always brought to everything, and she came home to that same house and that same life and found it, every time, sufficient. More than sufficient. In 1892, when James was 8 and Samuel was 4, and the spring had come early and warm to the territory, Charlotte found that she was expecting a third child. She told Vernon on a Sunday morning before the boys were up, at the kitchen table with the early light coming through the window, and this time he smiled straight away immediately, without the brief pause of composure breaking, smiled with the natural ease of a man who has learned that gladness does not cost him anything, and reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers. "Good," he said. And then, with the glint of something that was purely, simply happiness, "What do you suppose it will be this time?" "I have no reliable way to know that," Charlotte said, "and neither do you." "I think a girl," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table. "You are making predictions now." "I am expressing a hope," he said. "There is a distinction." She laughed, the full, real laugh that was only for him and the boys and the people she trusted entirely. "All right," she said. "A hope is permissible." Their daughter was born in October of 1892, exactly 10 years after Charlotte Talbot had stepped off the overnight stage at the Redemption Creek depot with everything broken and nothing left but her own considerable resources. They named her Alina Rose, and she arrived in the world with Charlotte's green eyes and her father's stillness and an expression of calm, evaluating attention that made Vernon Monroe, holding her for the first time, say, softly, to his wife who was watching from the pillow, She is going to see everything." "Yes," Charlotte said, looking at her daughter and her husband together in the October afternoon light of the bedroom where she had built so much of her life. "I think she will." The house on the north end of Redemption Creek was full that evening, James and Samuel pressing in to see their sister with the awed, uncertain reverence of boys encountering something entirely new. Margaret having arrived 3 days before with her husband William and their own 2-year-old, who was currently asleep in the guest room. Mrs. Holt next door having delivered an extraordinary quantity of food. Rosa having sent flowers from the shop. Reverend Webb having called in the morning to offer congratulations. When the evening had quieted and the boys were in bed and Margaret and William had retired and the baby was sleeping, and the house had settled into its night sounds, Vernon came back into the bedroom where Charlotte was sitting up against the pillows with the lamp low and the window showing the October stars, and he sat down beside her. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. In the crib by the window, Alina Rose Monroe breathed with the small, entire rhythm of new life. 10 years ago this month, Charlotte said quietly. "Yes," he said. "I was so afraid," she said. Not with distress, just as a fact she could hold now without flinching because it was past and it was also the beginning of everything. "I was so afraid and I was so determined not to show it." "I know," he said. "I could see both." She tilted her head to look at him. "And you sat on that bench anyway. And you sat down at the other end of it," he said, "which I think is the braver act." She considered this. "We were both very stubborn," she said. "We are still very stubborn," he said. "Yes," she agreed with some satisfaction. "We are." He pressed his lips against her hair. She closed her eyes for a moment and felt the whole of it, the house, the children, the work, the town, the decade of accumulated days and honest words and built things, the specific, reliable, permanent warmth of this man beside her. She had come to the Arizona territory with nothing but herself and her skills and her determination, and had found all of this. She had stood alone at the depot in the blue dark morning and had sat down on a bench, and had let herself be helped, and had stayed not because there was nothing to go back to, but because she had understood, somewhere in her bones, that this was where she was supposed to be. He had been there before the first whistle. And she had come. And that was how their story had begun. And this, the warm, complete, full life of the house on the north end of Redemption Creek, the children, the work, the deep and daily realness of each other, this was how it continued. Not with great drama, not with the sweeping gestures that belonged to other people's lives, but with the particular, durable beauty of two people who had found each other in the Arizona morning and had chosen, with clear eyes and steady hands, to stay. Vernon Monroe had been waiting before the first whistle. Charlotte Talbot had arrived, and everything that followed was exactly what it was supposed to be.